think as news creators and news gatekeepers, you have to think differently about how you produce the news then to fit for the different platforms that are being used by consumers. As for anyone?
Yes.
Why or why not?
I think one mistake that it's very easy to make when you're operating as a news organization is to just think, well, we'll just make our content available on all the platforms and we've ticked the box and that's fine. What that approach doesn't really take account of is the strengths or weaknesses of that particular platform. And you see it a lot, I think, in mobile sites, people approaching iPhone and that sort of thing. So I think really what it forces you to do as a news outlet is think about what your content actually is, what your base content is. In other words, where are you going to be providing that material to the most people? And still, for many consumers, is the website, even though that's starting to change now. But beyond that, you need to think, well, you know, what are the strengths of the iPhone, for instance, and how does that compare with the website? So that, I think, really forces you to think about the content that you provide. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to produce a whole new set of content, but it does mean that you have to prioritize different pieces of content, like video, for instance.
If I may add to that also, from a technology standpoint, one thing that I'm often asked is how that has influenced where people are finding news. And with the advent of social media, Facebook and Twitter, you're really reaching out, and in many cases, your people have the news find them. They're not necessarily going out and finding the news these days. You might sit down and you'll watch a newscast at night, you'll go online and find something, but with social networks like Twitter and Facebook playing an increasing role, getting out on mobiles, when you're producing content, I think the social side is also really important for the future of news, and I think everyone in media has recognized that.
And I think that also raises sort of a different philosophical question about the role of the journalist, because I think traditionally, you know, a journalist kind of goes out there and finds all the threads and pulls them together into a story. Well, now it's easier than ever for all of us to just go out and find those threads. And I think what we're seeing more and more is that mainstream journalism is kind of trying to figure out how we deal with this, right? So you see things like on CNN where they're reporting through Twitter, and there's, you know, they have segments where they're just talking about what people are talking about on Twitter, where people could just go and do that themselves. So I think that, you know, what the future is going to be like the future is here now, right? Things are changing remarkably quickly. I left the Globe just over 2 years ago, and you know, when I tell people that, they say, oh, you left at the right time. And certainly I couldn't have known at the time how much things were going to change, right? Like back then, if you thought that newspapers were, you know, could actually die, you were sort of an extreme, you know, you were had an extreme position. Now it's something that people are actually debating, like whether there is a sustainable model for newspapers, and that's a legitimate debate. So yeah, so the future is here and it's changing fast.
I think that's really funny. We're living in this age right now where it's really funny watching traditional media sort of try to figure out like what to do in this age of the web. You mentioned earlier about CNN and other channels or other broadcasters talking about Twitter streams. You know, I was on a treadmill earlier today trying to get in some exercise, and there's a TV there, and I turned it on, and CTV came up first. And there was this program, which I'm not familiar with. I have to be honest, I do not watch CTV programming. No disrespect to anyone in this room. It was called, I think, Toronto Talks or something like that. And there were two people sitting there on the screen, and they were taking calls from viewers. And you were just watching like these two heads sitting there listening to phone calls. And I was like, is this an appropriate use? And I assume that they've probably done this for years, and this isn't some sort of reaction to the web, but I think now that the web exists, you know, programming like that should perhaps be rethought, because I'm sure the demographic interested in that kind of thing would rather just go to the web and participate in a common thread. I think for that audience, for whoever turns into that program, is probably fine, but I think that demographic is going to sort of die, and then you won't have anyone coming up.
He's from an outspoken alternative media, in case you didn't know. Watchio likes to get depressed.
So if you're watching now, because 5 years from now, probably not gonna.
I think we'll move on to another question.
I think it's no surprise that the media industry has reacted to the economic downturn by downsizing, by rethinking their online strategies as well. There's a report from PricewaterhouseCoopers that internet revenue in the U.S., internet advertising revenue in the U.S. was down 5% in the first quarter. Really disappointed a lot of people in the media industry where they thought, of course, print revenue and some broadcast revenue would be down, but they thought digital revenue would still sustain them. So in light of the changing ad revenue and fluctuating rates these days, is it enough for news outlets, and specifically digital news outlets, to rely on ad revenue? Or is there another way to pad that bottom line or to sustain yourself in this very wild economic climate right now? And maybe we'll go with CBC first.
Well, CBC has a bit of a different funding model, as you know, but it's true. One thing I have seen, which I think is very interesting, is something coming out of the US called Spot.us, spot.us. It's actually a not-for-profit journalism site, but it still manages to produce good journalism and the people get paid. So if you were to pursue that and not want to make profits, I think that's an interesting way to go. Basically what happens, if you're not familiar with it, is that journalists will put out pitches on stories that they think should be covered in the community. At the moment in San Francisco, and it's just moved to LA as well. And the pitches will go out and the community will fund the stories if they believe that there's something there worth funding. So that essentially gives the journalist enough money to go cover that story and hopefully has some money left over for living. So I think that's a very interesting model. But of course that's not going to satisfy all news organizations, obviously, because they feel the need to make money. So we are seeing a lot of debate right now about micropayments and paywalls and that sort of thing, and the advent of this company called Journalism Online, which essentially says that it has 1,000 clients willing to charge their users for use of their content, which I guess we'll see, because it's had a lot of sign-ups, but still needs to roll out. And the question of whether people will actually pay for general news, I think, is still a bit of a dubious one in some respects. There is so much general news available out there for free on organizations like CBC, BBC. The question really is whether people will actually pay for that. And I think what we're seeing now is that people are more willing to pay for niche content. The Wall Street Journal has had a reasonably successful payment model, but, obviously for financial news, but whether people will really pay for general news, I don't know. I think one thing that's interesting right now also is kind of free plus premium content.
At Wall Street Journal, do they experiment with that?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
So some content is free, but then some content is behind a paywall.
And I'm also thinking of the music industry, where you're seeing some musicians actually start to offer things for free that people will just download, like songs. But what they're actually offering for premium prices is experiences, backstage access to concerts and one-on-ones with the musician and that sort of thing. So you can see that you may be able to transfer that model in some respect to the news industry as well.
Anyone care to respond?
Yeah, just from an alternative media standpoint, if you're going to take any good from what's come from an economic downturn, is that it's really forced everyone to focus on what do people want, how can you inform, and how can you reach them. And from a business model standpoint, a lot of Digital Journal, a lot of other online startups, they have different opportunities. When you don't have the capital resources of a large news organization, you develop technology that works, you develop technology that reaches people quickly, it's something that they want to use, and you have the opportunity to engage with your audience at an intimate level. So from a standpoint of building Digital Journal, we have technology behind it that there's a lot of interest in managing content, in syndicating content. How do you look at a global audience of 140 contributors and then turn those into a readership experience for no matter where you are in the world? So with the economic downturn, there's a lot of opportunity through mobile, through technology, and then as we see through increasingly in media, it's becoming social networks where people discuss news events on news sites and in alternative media.